She did not have a plan B. The plan was simple. Get inside, get close, get out alive. Alara had been running through the steps in her head for 6 months. Every morning before dawn, every night when sleep refused to come. She had cut her hair with a knife in the dark. She had wrapped herself tight with cloth strips until breathing was a shallow, measured thing. She had practiced walking the way her older cousin Nathan used to walk, shoulders first, chin level, no looking at feet. She had stolen a soldier's uniform off a fence post 3 villages east of the capital, and spent 2 weeks learning every crease, every button order, every way to fold the collar that said rank without speaking it. She was 19 years old, the last living member of the Ashen Pack, and she was walking through the gates of the Alpha King's palace under the name Eli Voss. The guards checked her papers without looking at her face. That was the thing about the palace entrance. There were too many people moving through it at dawn for anyone to look hard at any one of them. Carts, servants, soldiers rotating off night watch, kitchen staff, couriers. She was simply one more body in a crowd of bodies, carrying a satchel of documents that identified her as a newly assigned communications aide to the Eastern Wing office. The documents were forged. Alara had spent a significant portion of her blood money getting them made right. She passed through the gate and did not run. The Eastern Wing was exactly where she needed to be. The Alpha King's primary war council chamber sat adjacent to it, separated only by a long corridor and a set of heavy oak doors that were guarded during sessions but open between them. The communications office handled the routing of dispatches, the filing of orders, the logging of courier arrivals. It was not glamorous work. Nobody paid much attention to the people who did it. Nobody except, as she would learn within 48 hours, the Alpha King himself. His name was Kalen Dravith, and Alara had hated that name for 6 months before she ever saw the face attached to it. She had said it to herself in the dark, in the ruins of her pack's village, standing over the ground where her family had been buried without ceremony. Kalen Dravith, the man whose name was on the order, the man who had sent soldiers into the mountains to wipe out a pack that had never raised a hand against the throne. She had built a version of him in her mind over those 6 months. He would be large and loud, the way power often made men. He would wear his authority like a costume, something performative. He would not notice the people around him because noticing required a kind of attention that the very powerful rarely bothered with. She was wrong about almost everything except the large part. She saw him for the first time on her 3rd day at the palace, crossing the main hall toward the council chamber. He was not loud. He was not wearing his authority like a costume. He moved through the crowded hall the way a current moves through water, not fighting anything, simply present, and everything arranged itself accordingly. People stepped aside without being told to. Conversations dropped in volume as he passed. He did not acknowledge any of it. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired. His face was not what she had expected. It was not cruel, not dramatically hard the way the villain's face in a story is meant to be. It was watchful. He moved through rooms the way she had noticed careful people moved through unfamiliar spaces, aware of every exit, accounting for every person near him, not out of fear but out of something that looked like habit so deep it had become instinct. He did not look at her. She was standing near the message board, sorting a stack of dispatches by the seal of origin, and he passed within 4 feet of her without a single glance in her direction. She breathed out slowly and went back to the dispatches. She told herself the cold feeling moving up her spine was relief. She spent the first 2 weeks mapping the palace the way she would have mapped enemy terrain, methodically, without drawing attention to the process. She volunteered for extra courier runs because they took her through parts of the building that the Eastern Wing office had no official reason to access. She memorized which guards rotated when, which corridors went quiet at which hours, which rooms had 2 entrances and which had only 1. She was looking for the original records room. The extermination order that had been carried out against the Ashen Pack had a signature on it. She had seen it on the copy she had stolen from the Regional Enforcement Office 8 months ago, before everything fell apart. But the copy had been damaged, the lower portion of the document water-stained and unreadable. She had seen the seal of the palace on the upper portion. She had seen the date. She had not been able to read the full signature at the bottom. She needed the original. The palace records room was on the lower level of the north wing, which was approximately as far from the eastern wing as it was possible to get without leaving the building. She had 3 different routes planned to reach it. She was working through the logistics of each one during her lunch breaks, eating alone in the eastern corridor window seat, watching the foot traffic pattern below. It was on one of those lunch breaks, on the 14th day, that she heard the door at the far end of the corridor open. She did not look up from her bread. Footsteps, one set, heavy, measured, moving at an unhurried pace that she had already learned to recognize by that point without fully meaning to. She kept her eyes on the courtyard below. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. She counted to 3 in her head before she allowed herself a single sideways glance. The Alpha King was standing in the middle of the corridor, approximately 30 feet away. He was not looking at her. He was looking at nothing in particular, at the middle distance, as though he had simply paused on his way somewhere, and was now reconsidering the route. He stood very still, the way she had seen predators stand in the mountain forests back home, not frozen, not tense, but gathered, everything internal and contained. She looked back at the courtyard. 15 seconds passed. She heard him exhale, slow, deliberate. Then the footsteps resumed, not toward her, but in the opposite direction, back the way he had come. She sat at the window for a long time after he had gone. Her hands were steady. She checked, because she needed to know. They were perfectly steady. She was fine. The problem with the records room was not the distance. The problem was the guard schedule, which she had now mapped through 5 separate observation passes and found annoyingly consistent. There were 2 guards posted at the lower-level staircase between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning, the window she had identified as her best opportunity, and they did not rotate out or take breaks. She had watched long enough to confirm this was not a coincidence. Someone, at some point, had decided that the lower level needed reliable coverage during those hours. That someone had good instincts, which was irritating. She was still working through the problem on the 17th day when she arrived at the communications office in the morning, and found that her assignment had changed. The head of the Eastern Wing office, a thin, gray-haired man named Arthur Coles, handed her a new routing slip without looking up from his own work. She had been reassigned, the slip said, to direct dispatch handling for the War Council chamber, effective immediately. She was to report there at the start of each working day and remain until sessions concluded. She stared at the slip. "Is there a problem, Eli?" Arthur asked. "No," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. She folded the slip and put it in her pocket and went to the War Council chamber. The work was not meaningfully different from the communications office. Documents came in, documents went out. She logged arrivals and departures and ensured the right materials reached the right hands before each session began. The difference was proximity. The council chamber was a large, well-lit room, with a long central table and a seat at its head that no one sat in until Kalen Dravith entered the room each morning. He entered at the same time every day. He sat. He read whatever had been placed in front of him during the night session summary. She had started placing those herself after the first day, because the previous aide had been inconsistent about the order. He did not acknowledge her presence directly. He was aware of her. She knew this, not because he looked at her. He largely didn't, but because of the specific quality of his not looking. She had grown up in a pack. She had spent her life around wolves. She knew the difference between someone who genuinely hadn't noticed you and someone who had noticed you completely and was choosing not to show it. Kalen Dravith sat at the head of that table every morning and did not look at her and was absolutely, entirely, deeply aware of exactly where she was standing in relation to him at all times. This was a problem she had not budgeted for. She could not retreat from the assignment without drawing attention to the retreat. She could not ask to go back to the communications office without Arthur wanting a reason. She could not give a reason. So she stayed, and she stood in the War Council chamber each morning with her stack of dispatches, and she did her job with the kind of precision that made her invisible, which was the goal, which was what she needed. She told herself that whatever the Alpha King thought he had noticed, he was wrong. He was a wolf. She was a wolf. The bond that wolves had sometimes talked about in whispers back in her village, the pull between two people who were simply, biologically, inexplicably matched, was something she had grown up hearing about as both beautiful and terrifying. She had always thought it sounded like a loss of control dressed up in romantic language. She was not wrong about that part, as it turned out. What she had not accounted for was this. She could feel it too. It did not arrive all at once. That would have been dramatic and manageable. Something dramatic you could point to. You could say, that day, that moment, that is when it started. What she felt instead was a slow accumulation of small, specific wrongnesses. The way the room felt different when he entered it. The way she could track his location without looking. The way her own heartbeat did something she could not name whenever he spoke. Not to her, never to her, but to the room, to the council members, in that quiet, direct voice that did not perform authority but simply had it. She catalogued these wrongnesses each evening in the privacy of her assigned room. She wrote none of it down. On the 21st day, he passed her a document across the corner of the council table. a late-arriving courier report that needed to be logged before the session began. He held it out without looking up from the briefing he was reading. She reached across and took it. Their fingers did not touch. He made sure of it. She saw the precision of it, the way he adjusted his hold on the paper a fraction of a second before her hand arrived, creating just enough space between his fingers and hers that there was no contact. It was not a coincidence. You do not perform that kind of specific, deliberate avoidance without being aware of exactly what you are avoiding. She logged the document. She stood at her station for the rest of the session and did not look at him once and was aware of him the entire time. That evening she sat on the edge of her bed in the small room in the East Servants' Block and thought about the fact that she had come to this palace to find a name, a signature, and justice for her dead. She thought about the 6 months of grief and rage and careful, patient planning that had brought her to this corridor, this room, this assignment she had not asked for. She thought about the way a man could hold a document so that a certain person's fingers would not brush his. She got up and splashed cold water on her face and went back to planning the records room approach. She had found a third possibility, a maintenance access passage that ran along the north wing's lower level, used for pipe inspections, barely wide enough for one person moving sideways. The passage had a great access point near the east end of the corridor that lay outside the guard's direct sightline. She had confirmed its existence by accident during a courier run, glimpsing the grate cover at ankle height behind a storage shelf. She spent 3 evenings finding the maintenance schedule and confirming that the passage was only accessed during daylight hours on repair days. On the 26th day she went in. The passage was exactly as unpleasant as it looked from the outside, dark, low-ceilinged, smelling of old stone and standing water. She moved through it sideways with a small lamp pressed against her chest to keep the light from reaching the grate slats, counting her steps, mapping as she went. The records room access, she had confirmed from the maintenance drawings she found in the passage itself, water-stained but readable, was behind a locked interior door that the maintenance passage ran directly alongside. She picked the lock. She had learned to pick locks the same way she had learned most useful things, out of necessity, from someone who owed her a favor, practiced until it was automatic. The lock was old and not particularly sophisticated. She had it open in 40 seconds. The records room was large and cold and very quiet. She found the Ashenpack file in the third cabinet she opened. She stood in the dark with the original extermination order in her hands and read the signature at the bottom, and felt the floor of everything she had built shift under her feet. The name at the bottom of the order was not Kaelin Draveth. It was a name she recognized from the secondary documents she had collected over the months, a name that appeared in old enforcement records, in regional governance reports, in the margins of 2 different incident logs. High Advisor Garrett Holt, a man who had served the throne for 11 years under 2 different kings, a man who was, according to the date on his dismissal record sitting in the same cabinet, executed for corruption 7 months ago, 1 month before Alara had finished building her disguise. She stood in the cold records room for a long time. She read the document again. She read it a 3rd time. She checked the seal, the date, the signature. She checked the cabinet number and the cross-reference log to make sure she had the right file. She had the right file. Ilara Voss had walked into the palace of the man she had come to destroy, had spent 26 days inside his walls, had felt things she was not prepared to examine, and had just found out that she had been aiming at the wrong target for 6 months. She put the document back in the cabinet. She locked the door behind her. She moved through the maintenance passage and came back out through the grate and stood in the empty lower north corridor at 2 in the morning, with old stone smell in her hair and her hands very, very still. She had 2 choices. She could leave. Everything she had come for was gone, replaced by something too complicated and too painful to immediately process. She could walk out of the palace tonight, find a road, and disappear. She stood in the corridor and did not move toward any exit. She did not know, standing there, what that meant. She told herself she was simply tired. She told herself she would think about it in the morning. She went back to the East Servants' Block and lay down on her bed with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling until the light changed and it was time to go to work again. She went to work. She was still going to work 3 days later when the Alpha King walked into the War Council chamber in the morning, set his briefing documents on the table, and without sitting down, without looking up, said quietly into the room, which was otherwise empty, too early for the council members, only her present, the maintenance passage behind the north storage shelf. 3rd grate from the east end. You were in there 4 nights ago. Alara did not drop her dispatch stack. She set it down, carefully, on the corner of the table. The silence in the room was enormous. Kaelin Draveth finally looked at her, directly, fully. the way he had not done once in 26 days, despite knowing she was there every moment of them. "I know what you found," he said. She said nothing. "I know why you came here," he said. She still said nothing. "I also know," he said, and his voice was very level, very quiet, the way things are quiet when they are also very important, "that your name is not Eli." She held herself completely still. He looked at her across the length of the council table and said her name. Her real name. He said it the way you say something that you have been careful with, like something kept. The room was very quiet for a long time. Then Alara said, "How long have you known?" "Since the 14th day," he said. "The window seat, the eastern corridor." She counted backward. The 14th day, the lunch break, the footsteps that had slowed and then stopped. "You stood in that corridor for 15 seconds, she said. "Yes." "And you knew?" "Yes." She looked at him across the table. "Then why," she said, "did you reassign me to the council chamber?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at the briefing documents on the table, and then he looked back at her. "Because," he said, "I needed to be certain about what I thought I knew." She understood in that moment that he was not talking about her identity. She picked up her dispatch stack. She set it down again. "The man who signed the order against my pack," she said, "Garrett Holt, he is dead. He was executed last autumn," Kaylin said. 3 days after I found what he had done." She stood very still. "You knew," she said. "I found out afterward," he said, "not before." She wanted to call him a liar. She looked at his face and could not find the shape of a lie in it. She had spent a month watching this man's face across a room every single morning, learning the specific vocabulary of it, and she could not find the lie. She was not ready for any of this. "I need to think," she said. "Yes," he said. She walked out of the council chamber. He let her go. She walked down the eastern corridor and sat in the window seat where it had started, 26 days ago, and looked at the courtyard below, and thought about the ground where her family had been buried without ceremony, 6 months ago, 1 month before she finished building the disguise she was still wearing. She thought about the name she had hated for 6 months. She thought about fingers that had adjusted their position on a document by a precise fraction to ensure that no skin touched hers. She thought about the word kept. Outside the window, the palace courtyard was loud and ordinary and full of people going about their mornings. She sat in the window and let the noise of it wash over her, and did not cry, because she was very tired of crying, and because crying was something she had decided, in the mountains 8 months ago, to do afterward, when it was over. She was beginning to suspect that what she had called after might not mean what she had thought it meant. She stayed in the window seat until the morning session bell rang. Then she picked up her dispatch stack and went back to work. The War Council session that morning was about grain supply routes in the Western Province. Alara stood at her station in the corner of the chamber with her stack of dispatches and her logbook and listened to 6 men argue about numbers. She logged arrivals. She filed outgoing orders. She kept her face at the exact level of professional neutrality that made her invisible. Kaylin sat at the head of the table and ran the session the way he ran all of them, without raising his voice, without drama, with a kind of patient directness that moved things forward whether the men around the table wanted to move or not. He did not look at her. She had expected the session to feel different now that the thing between them was named. Not named between them. He had not named it, but acknowledged in the specific way that his eyes had found hers and said her real name. She had expected the air in the room to feel charged or strange. It felt exactly the same as it always did, which was, itself, a kind of answer to a question she had not asked yet. After the session, she filed the morning's dispatches, handed off the log to the afternoon aide, and went to the small dining hall for the midday break. She sat alone at the end of one of the long tables, she always sat alone, and ate without tasting the food, and thought about what she knew and what she did not know, and how those 2 categories had, over the past 3 hours, rearranged themselves completely. What she knew, Garrett Holt had signed the order. Garrett Holt was dead. Kaylin Draveth had executed him after discovering what he had done. What she did not know, whether after, was weeks or months, whether Kaylin had genuinely been unaware until after the massacre, or whether he had learned about it in time to stop it and chosen not to, whether the distinction mattered now. She ate her bread and thought about whether the distinction mattered now. It mattered. Of course it mattered. The entire shape of what she had come here to do depended on it. If he had known and allowed it, the wrong was his regardless of whose name was on the order. If he had genuinely not known, then the wrong was Garrett Holt's alone, and it had already been answered, and she had been 6 months in the mountains building a mission aimed at the wrong man. She needed to know which. She needed to look him in the face and ask him, directly, and then she needed to decide whether she believed his answer. She finished her meal. She went back to the eastern wing. She found him in his private study at the far end of the northern corridor, which she knew the location of because she had memorized the floor plan of the entire palace in her first week and had not needed to use that particular piece of information until now. The door was ajar. She knocked on the open frame. He looked up. "I need to know when you found out," she said. He set down the document he had been reading. She stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind her. She did not sit. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at him and waited. He said, 3 days after the massacre, I received a secondary field report from a different officer, one who had been present in the mountains and who sent his report directly to me rather than through Holt's office chain. That was when I learned what had happened. 3 days after, she said. Yes. You could not have stopped it. No. She stood with that for a moment. And then, she said, I began an investigation. It took me 4 months to gather the full documentation. Holt had been careful. He had routed the operation through channels designed to make it look like a routine enforcement action. It was not until the 6th month that I had enough to take to the tribunal. You executed him. Yes. She looked at his face. She had been watching his face every morning for a month. She knew its resting expression, its focused expression, the specific way his jaw settled when he was deciding something, versus when he had already decided. She could not find the shape of evasion in it now. She had been looking for it since he started speaking and she could not find it. This was deeply inconvenient. Why did you not make it public, she said. The PAC's records. A statement. Something official acknowledging what happened. I drafted one, he said. I was preparing to release it. Then I found out that you were here. She stared at him. You were preparing a public acknowledgement, she said slowly. And you paused it. I wanted to give it to you first, he said, before anyone else. That seemed right. She opened her mouth. She closed it. That is a very strange decision, she said. Yes, he said. Why, she said, and the word came out with more force than she intended. Would you pause an official acknowledgement of what happened to my PAC? To give it to me. A person you identified in a corridor 3 weeks ago. A person who entered your palace under a false identity. Why would that person's feelings about the timing of a public announcement matter enough to delay it? He looked at her steadily. You know why, he said. She did know why. That was the problem. She knew why in her bones, in her blood, in the specific wordless register that wolves understood before they had language for it. She had been pretending not to know it since the corridor on the 14th day. Don't, she said. I am not doing anything, he said. I am sitting at my desk. You know what I mean. I do, he said. And I am not going to push. I am simply answering your questions. She stood in the middle of the study and breathed carefully. You kept the disguise, she said. For 3 weeks. You knew I was here under a false identity and you said nothing, and you reassigned me to the council chamber and you, she stopped. What were you trying to understand? What were you deciding for 3 weeks? He was quiet for a moment. What you needed, he said. She had not expected that. I did not ask you to decide what I needed, she said. No, he said. You did not. She looked at the window behind his desk. The afternoon light was coming through it at a low angle, casting long shadows across the floor. She looked at the shadows and thought about the ruins of her village in the mountains and the graves and the 6 months, and the forged documents in her satchel, and the cloth wrappings she would take off tonight, the same way she had taken them off every night for 6 months, and put back on every morning. I have been very angry, she said, for a long time. It has been useful. I know, he said. I do not know what to do when the thing I am angry at is not what I thought it was. I know that too, he said. She looked at him. How? She said. He was quiet for a long moment. Because I spent 4 months being angry at a man under my own roof, he said, who was doing something I should have caught earlier. That anger was useful. And when it was over, when he was gone, the anger was still there and had nowhere to go, and that is a very specific kind of difficult. She had not expected him to say anything that sounded like that. She stood in his study for a moment longer. I want to read the original acknowledgement, she said, the one you drafted. I will have it brought to you, he said. She nodded once. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. My name, she said without turning around. When you said it this morning, in the council chamber, where did you learn it? The original field report, he said quietly. From the officer who came directly to me. He included a full census record of the Ashen Pack. Every name. I read them all. She stood in the doorway for another moment. She thought about a man sitting at a desk and reading through a list of names of people who were gone. She thought about her own name on that list. All right, she said. She left. She walked back through the northern corridor and down the stairs and into the eastern wing, and sat in the window seat for the third time, and stayed there until the light was completely gone from the courtyard below. The draft acknowledgement arrived at her room that evening, delivered by a young aide who knocked and handed her a sealed envelope and left without speaking. She sat on her bed and read it by lamplight. It was 3 pages. It named the Ashen Pack specifically. It named Garrett Holt as the sole authorizing official. It documented, in clear formal language, that the action had been carried out without the knowledge or order of the throne. It offered formal recognition of wrongful harm, and called for a record of restoration to be entered into the palace archives. It did not make the dead come back. She read it twice. She set it on the bed beside her. She had come here with a very specific idea of how this ended. She had imagined a confrontation, a reckoning, something that balanced the weight of what had been done against her pack. She had not thought beyond that confrontation because there was no beyond in the version she had been living inside for 6 months. There was the mission, and then there was nothing that needed to be imagined yet. Now she was sitting on a bed in the Alpha King's palace, reading a 3-page acknowledgement of her pack's destruction, knowing that the man who had signed the order was already dead, knowing that the man she had come to confront had spent 4 months quietly building the case that ended that man, and she had absolutely no idea what happened next. She lay back on the bed. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did sleep, she dreamed of the mountains, not of the ruins, but of the village before, her mother's voice in the next room, the sound of wind in the pines on the north slope, the particular quality of cold mountain air at dawn that she had not breathed in almost a year. She woke up crying and immediately stopped. After. She was still doing after. She was beginning to understand that after was not a place she arrived at. It was a thing she was already inside. In the morning she went to work. She arrived at the council chamber at the usual time. She arranged the session materials. She set the morning briefing at the head of the table, ordered by date received, the way she had started doing on her second day, because the previous aide had not cared about order and she did. Kalen arrived. He looked at the briefing stack. He looked at her. "Did you read it?" he said. "Yes," she said. He waited. "It is well written," she said. "That is not what I was asking." She looked at him. "I know what you were asking," she said. "I am working through it." "Take the time you need," he said. "I will be continuing my work here," she said. "As usual. I need you to understand that my continued presence in this position should not be interpreted as an answer to anything." He almost smiled. She was not certain, because she had not previously seen him smile, and this was subtle, a small shift in the set of his mouth, there and gone. "Understood," he said. She went to her station. She thought about that almost smile for the rest of the morning, and did not catalog the fact that she had noticed it. The session that day was about a border dispute in the Northeast. 2 lords were arguing in the kind of careful, polished language that was actually not polite at all. She logged dispatches, she filed orders. She watched Kalen navigate the argument with the specific patience of a man who had seen this particular dispute in many different costumes, and was not going to be hurried by any version of it. He had good instincts for people, she observed. He knew which points to press and which to let breathe. He knew when a man needed to feel heard before he would agree to anything. He did not use force when precision worked better. She was not cataloging these observations. She absolutely was cataloging these observations. After the session, one of the council lords, a heavy-set man named Lord Aldrich, who had been with the council for decades and who spoke to the communications aides with the specific bored condescension of someone who had never needed to pay attention to them, stopped beside her station as he was leaving. "You are new," he said, looking at her in the way she had learned to expect from certain men in certain rooms, the look that categorized and dismissed without much actual thought. "Yes," she said. "How old are you?" "Old enough to do the work," she said. Lord Aldrich blinked. That was not the answer aides gave. Aides gave deferential, factual answers to that sort of question. She watched him process the deviation, and then decide it was not interesting enough to pursue. "Right," he said, and left. She looked up from her log and found Kalen watching her from across the room. He had seen the exchange. He said nothing. He did not need to. The look on his face said something she could read, which was its own kind of problem. that she had gotten good enough at reading his face that a look from across a room was a conversation. She went back to her log. That evening she took off the cloth wrappings for the first time without immediately wanting to put them back on in the morning. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed and thought about what that meant. It meant that the disguise had been armor and was beginning to feel less necessary. It meant that something had shifted in the last 24 hours that she had not given herself permission to name yet. It meant that she was still in this palace, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she had, at some point in the last day, made a quiet decision that she was not fully admitting to herself. She would admit it eventually. She was not there yet. She put the wrappings on the chair instead of directly on top of the uniform laid out for mourning. It was a small thing. She was very good at small things. Ilara found out about the conspiracy on a Thursday. Not the old conspiracy, not Garrett Holt and the forged orders and the 6 months she had spent building a mission against the wrong man. A new one. A living one, with people still in it. It started with a dispatched letter that arrived in the council chamber during a session break, sealed with a merchant's wax but delivered by a courier in military uniform. She logged it as she would any arriving document, categorized it by seal type, set it in the appropriate tray. Then, 2 minutes later, she realized the military courier had not signed the delivery register. Couriers always signed the register. She looked at the sealed letter in the tray. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. She opened it. She read it very fast. She sealed it again using a small amount of wax and the nearest available seal ring from the supply drawer, not a match, but close enough from a distance, and placed it back in the tray. Then she stood at her station and spent the rest of the session being completely calm and useful and thinking very hard. The letter was not addressed to the council. It was addressed to a name she did not immediately recognize, Counselor Brennan, and its language was careful and layered in the way of messages that mean something different from what they appear to say. She had seen that kind of language before, in the secondary documents from her months of research. It was the particular vocabulary of people who needed to communicate, without leaving clear evidence of what they were communicating. The core of it, stripped of the careful layers, was this. The next council session needed to go a specific direction. There were people who needed specific information withheld from the king, and there was a name at the bottom, not signed, but referenced obliquely, that made her stomach drop. The name was Holt, not Garrett Holt. A different Holt. Alden Holt. A name she had seen in the margins of the same enforcement records she had spent 6 months studying. Garrett's younger brother, who had left the capital 4 years ago and whose current location no one in those documents had bothered to track. Someone had tracked him. Or he had come back. She needed to tell Kaylin. She knew this immediately, and without conflict, which was itself a data point she filed away. 2 months ago, the idea of willingly bringing information to the Alpha King would have been insane. Now it was simply the correct next action, and she knew it without having to think about it. And that fact said something loud and clear about what these weeks had done to the architecture of her intentions. She waited until after the session. He was the last to leave the council chamber, as he usually was, reviewing the session notes, making decisions about follow-up orders. She waited until the other council members had gone, and then closed the chamber door and brought the letter to the table and set it in front of him. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. "You opened it," he said. "Yes," she said. He picked it up and read it. She watched his face as he read, the focused expression, the jaw settling into the already decided position. He set the letter down. "Alden Holt," he said. "You know the name," she said. "I have been looking for him for 5 months," he said. "He disappeared from the capital before I finished building the case against his brother. I believed he was out of range. I was apparently wrong about that." "He has someone on the council," she said. "Yes. Counselor Brennan." "Yes. How long have you known about Brennan?" she said. He looked at her steadily. 3 weeks. She stared at him. "You have known for 3 weeks. I needed to know who Brennan was reporting to before I moved. If I had taken Brennan before finding Holt, Holt would have disappeared again." She thought about this. "So you have been waiting," she said. "Yes. While someone on your council was actively working against you." "Yes." She looked at the letter on the table. "This letter changes the timeline," she said. "Whatever Brennan is supposed to accomplish in the next session, if Holt is close enough to send a communication like this, he is not being cautious anymore. He is moving." "Yes," he said. "Which means you cannot wait." "No." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, which she had never done in this room. She had stood at her station for every session. She sat now, and put her hands flat on the table and thought. His brother's case, she said. The documentation you built. Holt would know what it contained. He and Garrett were close, based on the records I read. He would know where the holes were. There are not many holes, Kaylin said. There is one, she said. The Ashen Pack operation. Garrett Holt ran it, but the field records are incomplete. The officer who brought the secondary report to you directly, the one with the census. Where is that original report now? Kaylin was quiet for a moment. In the records room, he said. If Alden Holt is moving to protect his brother's legacy, she said, he would want that report. It is the piece that most clearly implicates Garrett without the throne's knowledge. If it disappears, the case for the operation being unauthorized becomes harder to prove. He looked at her. She looked back. You went to the records room, he said, on the night you found the order. Yes. And you know where the field report would be filed. Third cabinet. Cross-referenced under the Ashen Pack file. It will be right there. He stood. She stood. They looked at each other across the council table. I know this building better than most people who have lived here for years, she said. I memorized it. I know, he said. Then let me help, she said. He was quiet for just a moment. Not the long quiet of someone deciding something they were not sure of, but the short quiet of someone who had already decided, and was simply pausing before the beginning of a new thing. Yes, he said. They went out of the council chamber together, which was the first time they had moved through the same space, with the same purpose, rather than her trailing at a professional distance. She noticed this. She thought he noticed it too, from the specific way he adjusted his pace, not slowing to accommodate her, but simply moving at the same speed, which resulted in them walking side by side. She did not comment on it. She led them through the eastern corridor, down the servants' stair, along the maintenance passage she had mapped weeks ago, which required Kaylin to turn sideways through the tighter sections, which he did without complaint or comment. She appreciated this more than she was going to admit aloud. The records room, the cabinet, the file. She pulled the original field report. He read it there in the cold room by the light of the small lamp she had brought. This is it, he said. Yes. He folded it carefully and put it inside his jacket. This does not leave my possession, he said, until Holt is in custody. Agreed, she said. They were standing very close together in the narrow space between the cabinet rows. The room was small and cold, and the lamp made a small circle of warmth and light, and outside that circle everything was dark. She was aware of the distance between them, less than an arm's length, less than she had allowed since arriving at this palace. He was looking at the place in his jacket where he had put the document. You knew this room was here, he said quietly. You came here on your own, 3 weeks ago, because you were looking for evidence against me. Yes, she said. And what you found instead was evidence that I was not responsible. Yes. He looked up. And you stayed anyway, he said. She looked at him in the lamplight. I had nowhere else to be, she said. They both knew that was not the whole answer. She picked up the lamp and led them back through the maintenance passage and up the servants' stair and into the corridor. She was thinking about Brennan and the next council session, and Alden Holt and the timeline that was now compressing. She was thinking practically, methodically, the way she had been trained to think by 6 months of planning, and 4 more years before that of simply paying attention. The next session is in 2 days, she said. Yes. Brennan needs to believe nothing has changed between now and then. Yes. Which means, she said, that I need to walk into that chamber tomorrow morning, and behave exactly as I always have. Yes. She thought about this. I am very good at that, she said. He looked at her with the quiet expression that was becoming a familiar thing to her. Not warmth exactly, but something that included warmth among other things. I know, he said. They parted at the junction of the northern and eastern corridors. She went right, he went left. She did not look back, and she was quite certain he did not either, and they were both aware of the other not looking, which was itself a kind of looking. She returned to her room. She sat on the bed and thought about what she had just done. Not the records room, not the letter, not the practical logistics of the thing. What she had done was, she had gone to him. She had brought him the problem. She had sat down at his table and helped him think, and then she had led him through a dark passage to retrieve evidence that would protect his position. She had helped him. She had chosen to. That was not the action of someone who was still deciding. She had already decided. She had decided at some point in the last 4 weeks and had been moving around the decision rather than looking at it because looking at it meant acknowledging what had changed, and she was not quite ready for that. She was ready now. She lay back on her bed. She thought about the graves in the mountains. She thought about the acknowledgement letter still sitting on her bedside table. She thought about what it meant to have a mission and complete it, and then find that you had come out the other side of it, and were still a person who needed to decide what to do next. She thought about a man standing in a cold records room reading a field report in a lamplight circle. She breathed out. She was still in this palace because she was choosing to be. That was the answer. She was still in this palace because every morning she made a decision to stay, and every morning the decision was the same, and at some point, a series of identical daily decisions stopped being decisions and started being a direction. She was pointed somewhere. She was going to need to figure out what that meant. But first, Alden Holt. She turned the lamp out and lay in the dark and planned, the way she was good at, quietly and carefully, and without wasting any of the night. 2 days to the next council session. 2 days to make sure that whatever Brennan was supposed to accomplish in that room, he did not accomplish it. She was going to make sure of that. She was very good at making sure of things. The morning before the critical session, Lord Aldrich found out that Alara was a woman. It was not dramatic. It was not the result of clever detective work on his part. He walked around a corner in the east corridor and caught her coming out of the women's bathing room at the far end of the servant block, which she used at off hours precisely to avoid exactly this sort of thing. And today the timing had simply been wrong. He stared. She met his gaze and said nothing. He opened his mouth. She said, very evenly, "Good morning, Lord Aldrich." He closed his mouth. He opened it again. "You are he began. "An aide to the War Council chamber," she said. "I have been for the past 4 weeks. You have passed me in that room approximately 17 times. He stared at her for another long moment. She stood very still and let him stare. "Does the king know?" Aldrich said finally. "That is a question for the king," she said. She stepped past him and walked down the corridor at her usual pace. She could hear him behind her, turning, starting to say something else. She did not break stride. She reached the junction, turned east, and kept going. She had known this was coming eventually. She had factored it in. The question was not whether the disguise would break. Every disguise broke, if you stayed in a place long enough. But what happened when it did, and whether the timing worked with or against what she was trying to do. Today's timing was poor. She needed the council session to run normally tomorrow. She needed Brennan to believe nothing had changed. If Aldrich raised this in the council room before the session, if it became a disruption, a spectacle, the kind of thing that drew the room's attention away from the work and toward her, it could shift the dynamics in ways that Brennan might use. She needed to get ahead of it. She went to Kalen's study. He was already there, working. He looked up when she knocked. She stepped in and closed the door. "Aldrich knows," she said. He set down his pen. "When?" he said. 15 minutes ago. East corridor." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him run through the same calculations she had already run. Timing. The session tomorrow. Brennan. What Aldrich might do with the information. "He will go to the council," he said. "Before tomorrow's session," she said. "Possibly tonight," he said. She nodded. "Then we need to take the pressure away from it. If you address it first, not as a scandal, not as a deception, but simply as a known fact, there is nothing for Aldrich to reveal." He looked at her. "You want me to tell the council," he said. "I want you to tell them before Aldrich does," she said. "Frame it yourself. On your terms. On my terms." He was quiet for a moment. "And your identity. Your real name. Are you prepared for that?" "Alara Voss," she said. "Last surviving member of the Ashen Pack. I have been working in the communications office and the council chamber for 4 weeks. If anyone wants to discuss what that means, I will discuss it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are prepared to stand in that room and name yourself," he said. "I have been standing in that room for 4 weeks," she said. "The only thing that is changing is whether the room knows who I am." She held his gaze. He said, "This will also confirm that I have known." "For weeks." "Yes," she said. "There will be questions about why I did not act on it." "Yes," she said. "Are you prepared for those questions to be asked about you in your presence while you stand there?" She looked at him steadily. "I was prepared for you to try to execute me when I walked in the palace gate. A council chamber full of uncomfortable men is manageable." Something moved across his face, too quick to fully read, but she caught the edges of it. Not quite that almost smile. Something more serious. "I will call the council together tonight," he said. She nodded once. She started to turn for the door. "Alara," he said. She stopped. It was the first time he had used her real name since the morning in the council chamber. She turned. He said, You do not have to stand there and answer for it alone. She looked at him. I know, she said. She left before the thing in her chest could organize itself into anything she was not ready to say. The evening council gathering was not a formal session. It was called as an informal meeting, which meant it was held in the smaller side chamber with no seating structure, men standing in a loose cluster that was not arranged by rank. She arrived with Kaelin, walking beside him, which was already notable enough that two of the lords stopped their side conversations to watch the door. Aldrich was already there. He looked at her and then looked at Kaelin. Kaelin spoke first. He said, clearly and without preamble, that the aide working in the council chamber was Alara Voss, the surviving member of the Ashen Pack that had been destroyed under a false order 8 months ago. He said that he had been aware of her identity for 4 weeks. He said that she had been working in his council chamber because she was exceptionally good at the work, and that her continued presence there was by his decision. He said the name Ashen Pack the way you say something that should have been said in public a long time ago. Then he looked at the room and waited. The room was very quiet for a moment. Lord Aldrich spoke. He said it was irregular. Kaelin said yes, and waited. Lord Aldrich said that a woman working under a false identity in the palace communications office raised security concerns. Kaelin said that any security concern was outweighed by the quality of her work, and that the identity question was already resolved. He said this with the specific tone that closed a subject. Another lord, younger, one who rarely spoke in sessions, said, "The Ashen Pack. That was Holt's operation." "Yes," Kaelin said. "And she was here looking for justice," Alara said. The room turned. She had been standing slightly to the left of Kaelin, not behind him. She had made sure of the position. Adjacent, not subordinate. "I came here looking for justice," she said. "I found that the man responsible was already gone, and I found that the throne was already working to correct the record." She looked at the room. "The acknowledgement will be made public next week. I was asked if I wanted to be present when it was. I said yes." The room was quiet again. Aldrich said, "The disguise was necessary," she said. "I am the last survivor of a pack that was killed by an order bearing the palace seal. I needed to come here and find the truth. Disguise was how I survived long enough to do that. I would do it again." She said it calmly, not defiantly, simply as a fact. Aldrich looked at Kaelin. Kaelin looked back at him with the specific expression she had categorized weeks ago, the one that was not a threat, simply a very clear assessment. Aldrich said nothing further. The meeting dissolved gradually, the way these things did when the expected confrontation did not arrive. Men moved toward the door in ones and twos. Brennan lingered. She noticed this. He was the last to go, standing near the window for a beat too long before following the others out. She watched him leave and logged the hesitation and said nothing. When the room was clear, she and Kaelin were left standing in it. "That went better than I expected," she said. "Yes," he said. Brennan lingered, she said. "I saw. He will report to Holt tonight," she said. "Whatever he reports, it will change the plan for tomorrow." "Which is why," Kaelin said, "we have already changed ours." She looked at him. He explained, briefly, what had been put in motion while she had been in the East Corridor dealing with the aftermath of Aldrich. 3 palace guards reassigned. 2 different exits to the council chamber now blocked by plainclothes security. The regular delivery courier for the morning session replaced with one of his own people. Brennan would arrive tomorrow to a room that looked entirely normal and was not. She listened. She thought about the months she had spent planning her own mission, the same methodical patience, the same quiet layering of preparation, the accounting for what could go wrong. "You are very good at this," she said. "So are you," he said. They stood in the empty side chamber. She was thinking about tomorrow. She was also thinking about the fact that they were standing in a room together in the evening, and it felt not comfortable, that was not the right word, but not wrong, not strained. She had spent 6 months pretending, and 4 weeks half pretending, and this moment, this empty room, was the first one that felt entirely real in a way she had not expected to feel again. She looked at the window Brennan had stood near. "If Holt is close enough to communicate with Brennan regularly," she said, "there is a chance he is physically somewhere near the capital." "Yes," Kaelin said, "my people are working that angle." "What do you need from me?" she said. He looked at her. She meant it practically. She had skills that were relevant. She had proven that several times now, and she was done pretending she did not. "Tomorrow," he said, "your position in that chamber, your read on Brennan. I will watch him," she said. "And if something moves in a direction I have not planned for, I will handle it, she said. Yes, he said simply. No qualification. No version of, but are you certain or are you sure? Just yes. The way you confirm something that does not need to be debated. She said goodnight. She went back to her room. She lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about tomorrow, and about Alden Holt, and about the specific clean feeling of being useful in a way that used everything she had, rather than suppressing most of it. She had been suppressing most of it for 6 months. The relief of not doing that, of sitting at a table and being allowed to think out loud and have those thoughts taken seriously, was something she had not prepared for feeling. She added it to the list of things she was not ready to examine yet, but was no longer able to pretend were not there. The list was getting long. She would have to deal with it eventually. Tomorrow first. The session began at the usual hour. Ilara stood at her station. The council members filed in. Brennan arrived third, which was earlier than his usual timing. She noted it without moving. He took his seat and arranged his papers and did not look toward her station more than twice, which for Brennan was normal. She watched everything without appearing to watch anything. This was a skill she had developed at the age of 11, living in a pack where the difference between understanding a room and misreading it could have real consequences. She had been good at it then. She was very good at it now. Kaelin entered last. The session opened on the topic of northern trade permits, which was exactly the kind of slow administrative subject that made most of the council check their attention at the door and let their thoughts wander. She had planned this, had suggested to Kaelin the night before that if the opening topic was sufficiently dull, Brennan would be lulled into the comfort of familiarity before whatever he intended to do. It was working. She could read it in the set of Brennan's shoulders. He was waiting for the right moment, telling himself the right moment was later, letting the trade permit discussion drain away his edge. She watched him and thought about where Alden Holt was at this exact moment. Somewhere close. She believed that. A man who sent a letter that specific was not writing from 3 provinces away. He was near enough to act on whatever Brennan was supposed to accomplish. He was near enough to move fast if something went wrong. The session moved from trade permits to water rights in the southern border territory. 2 of the council lords began a side argument that required Kaelin's attention to redirect. Ilara used the 8 seconds of general distraction to step back from her station, move along the chamber wall to the small side door that led to the delivery antechamber, and look through the antechamber window. The courtyard below was busy with the usual morning traffic. She looked for a long moment. A man standing near the far gate who was not moving with the usual purpose of people who had somewhere to be, standing slightly sideways to the gate, positioned so that he could see both the gate and the eastern tower entrance without appearing to watch either. She looked at him for 4 seconds. She went back to her station. She did not do anything dramatic. She picked up a single document from her dispatch stack, walked it to the end of the council table, set it near Kaelin's right hand, and returned to her station. It was a blank document. She had prepared it that morning for exactly this purpose. Kaelin glanced at it in the middle of a sentence, finished the sentence, picked up the document, and turned it over. He looked up. Their eyes met across the room. She looked down at her log, then looked at the antechamber door, then back at her log. He continued the session without a visible change in his expression. 3 minutes later, she heard the soft sound of the corridor door opening and closing. One of Kaelin's plainclothes guards, she knew, moving out without making it a production. She logged a delivery and said nothing. Brennan made his move 7 minutes into the water rights discussion. It was subtle. She had been watching for subtle. He introduced a secondary document into the discussion. A report, he said, from the Southern Territorial Administrators, suggesting that the current trade enforcement in the area was creating hardship on local merchant families. He passed copies around the table. He framed it as relevant context for the water rights question. She looked at the copy that reached her end of the table. The document was real. It was from a legitimate administrative office. But attached to the back of it, folded in, was a second sheet that was not from any administrative office. It was a privately drafted summary that suggested, in careful language, that the king's current northern border policy was creating the conditions for the unrest rather than containing it, that the real threat was not external but internal, and that a change of advisory council structure might be necessary. It was the kind of document that, introduced casually into a briefing and left to sit, could begin to shift opinion without anyone being quite able to point to the moment it happened. She pulled the second sheet out of her copy. She walked it to the end of the table and set it next to the blank document she had delivered earlier. She went back to her station. Kaelin picked it up without looking away from the council lord he was addressing. He set it aside. Brennan had been watching this exchange without appearing to watch it. She saw the moment he understood that his carefully planted material had been removed before it could circulate. He sat very still for approximately 3 seconds. Then he began to stand. "I need to correct," he started. The chamber door opened. 2 palace guards stepped inside. They did not rush. They moved with the specific economy of people who had a clear purpose and no need to perform urgency. They went to either side of Brennan's chair. Brennan looked at the guards. He looked at Kaelin. Kaelin was looking at him with the expression she had first learned to read 2 months ago, the one that was not a threat, simply a very clear accounting. "Lord Brennan," Kaelin said, "we need to have a separate conversation." Brennan sat back down. The council watched this unfold with the stillness of a room that has suddenly understood. It was in the middle of something larger than a water rights discussion. Lord Aldrich, she noticed, looked at her. She met his gaze with the same level expression she had been giving him for 2 months. He looked away first. The session continued. Brennan was escorted out with a minimum of disruption. The water rights question was resolved. Trade was discussed. The session ran its full length and closed at the usual time. Afterward, when the council members had filed out and she was gathering the session materials, she heard from the corridor that Alden Holt had been taken at the eastern gate. The man she had identified through the antechamber window. She stood with a stack of documents in her hands and breathed. It was over. Not the grief. Grief did not work on a clean timeline, she had learned this. But the active threat, the moving pieces, the people who had wanted to protect the legacy of what had been done to her pack, they were contained. She set the documents down on the table. She sat in one of the council chairs for the first time. She had never sat in one of these chairs, had always been at her station, standing. She sat now and looked at the long empty table and the empty seats, and thought about the 26 days she had spent standing at the edge of this room, pretending to be someone else. She did not hear Kaelin come back in. She heard him when he was already halfway across the room. He stopped when he saw her sitting. She did not stand. She looked at him. "Holt?" she said. "In custody," he said. She nodded. He pulled out the chair at the end of the table, not the head, the corner, and sat down. They were at right angles to each other, which was not quite the same as sitting across from each other, and not quite the same as sitting side by side. It was, she thought, very them. "Brennan," she said. "Talking," he said. "He will keep talking. He wants a reduced sentence." "He will probably get one," she said. "Probably," Kaelin agreed. She looked at the table. "The field report," she said. "Safe," he said. "Still in my jacket." She almost smiled. She did not fully smile, but she came very close, and she was aware of it, and she was aware that he was aware of it. "The acknowledgement," she said. "You said next week." "Yes. I want to be there," she said. "When it is read publicly, I want to stand in the room." "Yes," he said. "I know." She sat with that for a moment. "My pack was 14 people," she said. "My mother, my father, 2 of my cousins, the old woman who had lived in the village longer than anyone could remember, and who everyone called grandmother, even though she was not, 10 others. They were not important to anyone outside those mountains." She stopped. "They were important to me." "Yes," he said. He did not say anything else. He let the weight of it sit without adding to it or softening it, which was the right thing to do, and she was grateful for it. "I have been carrying them," she said. "This whole time, since the mountains. I did not think I would still be carrying them at the end of this." "What did you think it would feel like?" he said. "Empty," she said. "I thought if I got here and did what I came to do, it would feel like putting something down, that there would be a space after." "There is a space," he said. "It just does not feel like empty." She looked at him. "No," she said, "it doesn't." Outside the council chamber windows, the courtyard was loud with the aftermath of the morning. Raised voices from the eastern gate, guards moving, the kind of controlled commotion that followed a security action. All of it ordinary, all of it the business of a palace continuing to function. She was still in a chair at the council table. She had not stood up. She was not sure, yet, exactly what that meant. She was beginning to think that maybe not being sure yet was acceptable, that she had spent a long time being certain about things, the mission, the name, the target, the plan, and that certainty had kept her functional and alive and moving. But certainty was not the only mode. It was not even always the most honest mode. "I need to find something to do," she said. "Here, a real function, not just dispatch logging." "Yes," he said. "The communications office is inadequate." "Yes," he said. "It is." I was better at this, she said, gesturing slightly at the empty room. At this morning. You were extraordinary at this morning, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. She said, that is not nothing, for you to say. No, he said, it is not. She sat in the chair at the council table and thought about what she was going to do next. She was not leaving. That much she knew. Everything else was still being decided. But she was not leaving, and she was useful, and she was being honest about who she was for the first time in 6 months, and the man sitting at the corner of the table was looking at her the way he had looked at her since the first week, with the specific, patient, complete attention of someone who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the right time to say it clearly. She thought she might be getting close to that time. She was not quite there, but she was getting close. The public acknowledgement was read on a Tuesday in the main hall of the palace, with the full court present. Elara stood at the front of the room in her own name and her own clothes for the first time since she had arrived at the gate 6 weeks ago. She wore nothing remarkable. A simple dark wool jacket, her hair grown enough to curl at the nape of her neck. She had left the cloth wrappings in her room that morning, with the deliberateness of someone closing a chapter. Kalen read the acknowledgement himself. She had not expected that. She had expected a formal reader, a secretary, the way official statements usually worked. He stood at the front of the court and read it in his own voice, clearly, without ceremony but without rushing it either. He read every name, all 14 of them. He named Garrett Holt. He stated the throne's responsibility for the failure of oversight that had allowed a corrupt official to act without the throne's knowledge or consent. He announced the record of restoration. He did not look at her while he read. She was glad of this. She was not certain she could have held her face steady if he had. She stood and listened to her family's names said in a room full of people, officially, on record. And it was not the closing she had imagined in the mountains. It was not empty. It was full of something she did not have a word for yet. A sharp, aching, complicated fullness, like a thing that had been wrong for a long time returning to the shape it was supposed to have, which should feel like relief but mostly just felt like grief in a different key. When it was over, the court was quiet for a moment. Then the usual business resumed, the way it always did. She stood at the front of the room until the cluster of people around her had thinned, accepting the few condolences offered in the careful, slightly awkward way of people who are not sure what to say to someone who has lived through something they can barely imagine. She was gracious, she was fine. She thanked people and shook hands and did not feel any of it particularly deeply, because she was saving that for later, for the private version, for the room with no one in it. She found Kalen afterward in the corridor outside the main hall. He was talking to 2 of his senior staff about the Brennan tribunal proceedings. She stood nearby and waited. He wrapped up the conversation in a few minutes and the staff departed, and then it was just the 2 of them in the corridor. Thank you, she said. Yes, he said. For reading it yourself, she said. He was quiet for a moment. It needed to come from the king, he said, not from a reader. The acknowledgement only means something if the person saying it is actually accountable. She nodded. You read all the names, she said. Yes. She had not told him to do that. He had done it on his own. She stood in the corridor and did not say anything for a moment, because the thing she was feeling did not translate well into words right now, and she had decided some time ago that not saying things badly was sometimes better than saying them wrong. What happens to Holt? She said. What is the process? Tribunal within the month, he said. The documentation from his brother's case is being reviewed for conspiracy to obstruct. What you found in the letter Brennan received adds a secondary charge. Will it hold? She said. Yes, he said. The letter alone is enough. The rest is additive. She nodded. They stood in the corridor. I have been thinking about the position you mentioned, she said. In this office. What function actually exists? Tell me what you have been thinking, he said. She had been thinking about it very carefully for 3 days, in the methodical way she applied to problems that mattered. The communications function in the Eastern Wing is a clearinghouse. Things come in, things go out, and no one in that office is actually reading them for pattern. They are just logging and routing. Yes, he said. The council chamber is different. There is pattern recognition there, but it is reactive. The council sees what is brought to them. They do not go looking. Yes, he said. What you actually need, she said, is someone between those 2 functions. Someone who reads the incoming intelligence stream and identifies what is noise and what is signal before it reaches the council level. Someone who is looking for things like that letter, not just processing the obvious, but noticing the things that do not quite fit. He was watching her with attention. She kept going. That is not a communications aid function, and it is not a council secretary function. It is something else. I do not think you have that function formally built into the office structure. No, he said, I do not. I am suggesting you build it, she said, and I am suggesting that I do it. He was quiet for a moment. You understand, he said, that this would make you a permanent position in this palace. Yes, she said, and that it would require you to stay. Yes, she said. He looked at her. You are not staying because of the position, he said. No, she said. She held his gaze. But the position is also real and useful, and I would actually be good at it, she said. Both things can be true. Yes, he said, they can. He said he would have the formal documentation drafted by the end of the week. She said she did not need the documentation to start. She was already looking at the incoming intelligence stream, and she might as well be doing it with an actual mandate. He said that was exactly what he expected her to say. She said that he should probably expect that kind of thing regularly. He said he was counting on it. She went back to the Eastern Wing and sat at her station and pulled the previous month's dispatch logs and started reading them differently than they had been read before. Not for routing purposes, but for pattern. For the slight wrongness of a document that did not quite belong to the category it had been filed under. For the gaps and repetitions and silences that were actually as loud as anything spoken clearly. She found two things of interest by the end of the afternoon. She brought them to Kalen's study before the day ended. He read what she had marked. He asked 3 questions. She answered them. He said the second item was probably nothing but the first warranted a closer look, and he would have his northern contacts check it. She said she agreed about the second and had already started building a cross-reference on the first. He looked at her across the desk. You started the cross-reference before you came here, he said. Of course, she said. Before I told you whether I thought it warranted investigation. I thought it did, she said. My read on it is usually reliable. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that she had stopped trying to categorize and had simply started accepting as a known thing. The attentive, specific, complete look. Yes, he said. It is. She went back to the Eastern Wing. That evening she wrote a letter. She had not written a letter since before she came to the palace. The last letter she had written was to the Regional Enforcement Office in the mountains, a formal complaint about the Ashenpak massacre that had gotten no response and had, in hindsight, probably contributed to her deciding that the formal approach was insufficient. This letter was different. It was addressed to the regional community leader in the district adjacent to the mountain territory where the Ashenpak had lived. She had researched the name, a woman named Clara Dunn who had been the regional contact for several Pack communities in the area, and who had, according to the records, sent a formal inquiry about the Ashenpak situation 7 months ago that had gone unanswered. She wrote to Clara Dunn. She said who she was. She said what she knew. She said that there was now an official record of what had happened and where to access it. She said she was well and she was in the capital and she was working. She sealed the letter. She was going to send it in the morning through the official courier service, properly, with a real name on the return address. She sat with the sealed letter in her hands for a moment. She had not said her own name in a real sentence addressed to a real person outside this palace, since before the mountains. She had been Eli for 6 months. She had been the last survivor, the mission, the disguise. She had been a purpose held tight against the fear of what she would be without it. She was Alara. She had a function. She was staying. She set the letter on the desk beside her window. Outside, the palace grounds were settling into the evening quiet. A few guards moving, kitchen lights beginning to go dark, the particular stillness of a large building at the end of a day. She thought about what it meant to have a day end. For a long time she had not thought about days ending. She had thought about days as segments of a task, what she needed to accomplish before the next stage of the mission, what she needed to learn before the next move. Days did not end. They just continued into the next thing. This day had ended. She had done work that mattered. She had done it as herself. She had written a letter with her real name on it. Tomorrow she would do more work and it would matter, and she would do it as herself, and eventually the tribunal would happen, and the acknowledgement would settle into the record, and the cross-reference she had started today would probably lead to something worth knowing. And she would be here for all of it. That was not nothing. That was in fact quite a lot. She turned out the lamp and lay on the bed, and breathed in the quiet, and did not map the exits. She slept. In the morning she put on her jacket, not a borrowed uniform, and picked up the letter off the desk and went out into the corridor. She had work to do. She was looking forward to it. The cross-reference she had started on her second day in the new role led, 12 days later, to a man named Oliver Fenn. She found him through his handwriting. That was not how she had expected to find him. She had expected it to be something in the document content itself, some inconsistency in reported figures or an implausible timeline. Instead, it was the specific way the letter S curved in 3 separate dispatches from 3 separate claimed offices, dispatches that had arrived in the palace communication stream over a span of 4 months. 3 different originating locations, 3 different sender names, the same handwriting. Someone had been feeding false intelligence into the palace communications system using fabricated regional authorities. She brought the 3 documents side by side on her desk and looked at them for a long time. Then she went to Kaelin's study. He was in a meeting when she arrived. His aide, a young man named Percy who had recently started treating her with the specific, careful respect of someone who was not entirely sure of the hierarchy and was playing it safe, told her he would be another 20 minutes. She sat in the corridor outside his study and waited with the 3 documents and thought about the implications of what she had found. The false intelligence had been routed into the stream over 4 months. That predated Brennan's involvement, or ran parallel to it. If Brennan had been acting on intelligence he believed was legitimate, intelligence that was actually fabricated, then the conspiracy was larger and more structured than they had assumed. Brennan might not even know that some of his sources were false. Or Brennan knew exactly, and Oliver Fenn was one of his people. She needed the Brennan tribunal records. She was going to need to ask for access she did not technically have yet. Kaelin came out of his meeting at the 22-minute mark. He saw her in the corridor and did not show surprise. She had been showing up outside his study regularly for 12 days now, and he had adapted to this the way he adapted to most things she did, which was quickly and without making a production of the adaptation. She handed him the 3 documents. He stood in the corridor and read them. "The handwriting," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the 3 letters in sequence and then back at her. 4 months, he said. "At minimum," she said. "I have only had access to the last 6 months of dispatch logs. It could go further back." "Brennan," he said. "Possible," she said. "Or someone above Brennan." He looked at her. "Above Brennan," he said. "Brennan is a counselor. He is not particularly imaginative. Someone constructed a 4-month intelligence fabrication operation using multiple false identities and consistent enough handwriting to avoid detection by anyone not specifically looking for pattern. That is not Brennan's architecture." He was quiet for a moment. "You want the tribunal records," he said. "Yes," she said. He went back into his study and came out 2 minutes later with a written authorization slip. She spent the rest of the day in the tribunal records office, which was a small room in the palace's administrative west wing that she had not needed to access before and had therefore not fully mapped. The tribunal clerk, a woman named Grace who regarded Ilara's authorization slip with the careful attention of someone who took the rules of document access very seriously, let her in and set up a reading station and left her alone. She read everything. Brennan had been talking, as Kaelin had predicted. He had given the tribunal a significant amount of detail about the communications he had received from Alden Holt's people. Most of it tracked with what she already knew, but at the back of the final session's record, in a section of Brennan's testimony that she almost missed, because the tribunal secretary had formatted it oddly, there was a name, not Oliver Fenn, a different name, Fletcher Crane, former palace archivist, dismissed 4 years ago for reasons the record listed as administrative restructuring, which was the way records listed things when the real reason was not something anyone wanted to document clearly. She looked at that name for a long time. Former archivist. A person who had spent years in this palace and would know its communication systems and its document routing protocols and its security gaps better than almost anyone who had worked here since. She left the tribunal records office at dusk and went directly to Kaelin. He was still in the palace. She had learned that he was almost always still in the palace at this hour, the last to leave most evenings, working through what the day had not finished. She found him in the council chamber, alone, reviewing something she did not try to read. She said, "Fletcher Crane." He looked up. She put the copied tribunal record excerpt on the table. He read it. "Crane," he said. "You know the name," she said. "I know it from the archivist records," he said slowly. "He was dismissed before I took this position. It was in the administrative history I reviewed when I started, a note about a restructuring." "The restructuring was not a restructuring," she said. "No," he said. He was looking at the record with the focused expression. "I need to pull the original dismissal file." "I would start there," she said, "and I would cross-reference it against the dates on the fabricated dispatches. If Crane was dismissed within a month of the earliest one, The timeline fits. He stood up. She followed him to the records room, not through the maintenance passage this time. Kaylin simply requested the guard's access key from the corridor post, which was a rather more efficient method that she observed without comment. The records room was the same cold space it had been when she had come here on her own, weeks ago, the same cabinets, the same quiet. Different, now, because she was here openly, and with purpose, and beside someone instead of alone. He found the archivist personnel records. Fletcher Crane, dismissed 7 months after Garrett Holt's appointment as High Advisor. Reason: disagreement over archive access protocols. One formal complaint from Crane against the High Advisor's office, documented, marked as reviewed and dismissed. Holt had him removed, she said. Yes, Kaylin said. And then Crane spent the next 4 years building a false intelligence network to put back in place whatever Holt had been trying to do, she said, using Alden Holt as the figurehead. This is Crane's operation. Alden Holt is a useful name, a useful connection to the old grievance, but Crane is the architect. Kaylin set the file down. He looked at her. We have Alden Holt, he said. We have Brennan. Crane does not know we know his name. Not yet, she said. How long do we have before he realizes Brennan has talked? Depending on how careful Crane is about monitoring the tribunal proceedings, weeks, maybe less. He was quiet for a moment. Then we move, he said. Yes, she said, carefully. They stood in the cold records room in the evening, the same space where she had stood alone weeks ago, and discovered that everything she thought she knew was wrong. She thought about that night, the field report in her hands, the floor shifting, everything that had followed from that moment. I keep coming back to this room, she said. He looked at her. She had not meant to say that out loud. It was the kind of observation she usually kept in the private column. This room has been useful, he said. Yes, she said. She looked at the cabinet where the Ashen Pack file sat. She had not opened it again since that first night. She did not need to. She knew every word in it, had read it in the dark with a lamp pressed close. When this is resolved, she said, Crane and everything connected to it, I want to build a proper archive protocol for the intelligence stream, something systematic that does not rely on one person noticing that 3 letters have the same handwriting curve. Yes, he said. I have been thinking about how it would work, she said. A classification system at intake, pattern flags, cross-reference requirements before anything enters the live briefing stream. When this is resolved, he said, build it. She looked at him. She said, you keep saying yes to things before I finish describing them. Because you are usually right about where you are going, he said. She held that for a moment. That is a significant amount of trust, she said, for someone you have known for 2 months. He looked at her with the full, steady attention that she had by now entirely stopped trying to explain away. The bond is not new to me, he said quietly. I have known about it since the corridor. What I have been observing for 2 months is not whether I trust you. It is whether you trust yourself enough to stay. She stood very still. You think I did not, she said. I think you came here for one reason, he said. And when that reason turned out not to be what you expected, you had to find out if there was another one. That takes time. She looked at the records cabinet. She looked at the cold stone floor. She looked at the small lamp that was the only light in the room. I trust myself, she said. Yes, he said. I can see that. I do not need someone to trust it on my behalf. I know, he said. I am not offering to trust it on your behalf. I am simply observing that you have it. She looked at him. She thought about 6 months in the mountains. She thought about the disguise and the forged documents and the gate and the dispatch logs and the maintenance passage and the council chamber and the morning she had walked back into it the day after her real name was first said aloud in this palace. She thought about the fact that she had come here to burn something down and had stayed to build something instead. I am not going to say it tonight, she said. He nodded once. No rush, he said. She picked up the Crane file from the cabinet where he had set it down. She tucked it under her arm. We need to move quickly on this, she said. Yes, he said. They left the records room. She was going to say it eventually. She was not ready tonight, and that was fine because she had decided that not being ready yet was acceptable, and the man beside her had demonstrated, fairly consistently over the past 2 months, that he was capable of waiting. That was, she thought, as she walked through the corridor with the Crane file under her arm, one of his better qualities. She was not going to tell him that yet either. One thing at a time. Fletcher Crane was arrested on a Wednesday, in a boarding house 3 streets from the palace's eastern gate. He had been living there for 6 weeks, which meant he had arrived at approximately the same time Alara had been reassigned to the council chamber. She thought about this on the morning after the arrest and decided that the timing was probably not coincidental, which said something about how long Crane had known that things were moving in a direction he did not want. He had been close enough to receive updates from Brennan, close enough to run. He had not run fast enough. She was not in the room when he was brought in for questioning. She had not asked to be, partly because it was not her function, and partly because she had decided, in the careful accounting she did each evening, that she did not need to see Fletcher Crane's face to feel like this part was complete. The arrest was enough. The documentation she had built, the 3 handwriting samples, the cross-references, the timeline mapped against his dismissal date, that had been her contribution to it. The rest was the tribunal's work. She had done her part. She let that sit for a moment, because it was a new feeling, not the hollow, incomplete feeling she had expected when she imagined the end of this, but something more like recognition. A clean edge where the work finished and she could set it down without losing the shape of herself in the setting down. She went to the communications office and pulled the previous week's dispatch intake logs. She was building the classification system. She had started the framework 2 evenings ago, working through the logic of it in her notebook. What categories made sense at intake? What flags needed to trigger a secondary review? How to build the cross-reference requirement so it was useful without slowing the flow of legitimate intelligence. She worked on it for 3 hours. Percy knocked on the door and told her the king was requesting her presence. She put a mark in her notebook at the point where she had stopped and went to find Kalen. He was in the small side chamber, the same room where the evening gathering had been held after Aldrich's discovery. She thought about that evening sometimes, the way she had stood beside Kalen, not behind him, and named herself in a room full of council lords. He was not alone. There was a woman in the room, perhaps 60 years old, with the specific posture of someone who had spent a significant portion of their life being the most capable person in whatever room they were in. She had a traveling coat, dusty from the road. She was standing with a cup of tea in one hand and the air of someone who had arrived recently and already assessed the room. She looked at Alara when Alara walked in. Alara looked back. "Alara," Kalen said. "This is Clara Dunn." She had not expected that. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Clara Dunn looked at her with the eyes of someone who had been in correspondence about things she had not been able to do anything about for a long time, and who was now looking at the person at the center of those things, standing upright in front of her. "You wrote to me," Clara said. "Yes," Alara said. "I received your letter 9 days ago," Clara said. "I came as soon as I had my affairs arranged. I have been working with the Mountain District communities for 11 years. Your PAC situation was one I had filed a formal inquiry about." "I know," Alara said. "I found your inquiry in the records. It was marked unresolved. It was ignored," Clara said. "There is a difference." "Yes," Alara said. She stepped fully into the room. Clara set down her teacup. "I would like to tell you," she said, "about the 7 months I spent trying to get someone in this palace to pay attention to what happened in those mountains. I would like to tell you, and then I would like to hear from you how we are going to make sure that it does not happen again." Alara looked at this woman who had spent 7 months fighting and not been heard. "Sit down," Alara said. "Both of you." She pulled 3 chairs close and sat in one and looked at Clara and looked at Kalen. "Start from your inquiry," she said to Clara. "I want to hear everything." Clara started. She talked for 40 minutes. She talked about the regional network she maintained, the early reports she had received from neighboring communities who had seen the soldiers in the mountain roads, the frantic 3-week period when no one in the Ashen Pact territory had responded to any of the community communication channels, and then the silence, and then the confirmation she had pieced together from 4 different sources because nobody official had told her anything directly. She talked about the formal inquiry that had gone to Garrett Holt's office and received a form response about ongoing territorial enforcement actions. She talked about the second inquiry that had gotten no response. She talked about the third, which had been returned to her unopened. She talked about this with the specific controlled anger of someone who had gotten very practiced at controlling it. Alara listened without interrupting. Kalen listened. When Clara finished, Alara said, "You were aware of what was happening, and you had no channel to escalate it. The formal inquiry process was controlled by the same office that had authorized the operation." "Yes," Clara said. "There is a gap in the existing system," Alara said. She looked at Kalen. "The intelligence classification framework I am building, I want to add a regional reporting protocol, an independent channel for exactly what Clara was trying to do, one that does not route through the council advisory offices." Kalen said, "What would that look like?" She thought about it for a moment. A small regional oversight network, she said. People like Clara who have existing relationships with the communities in their areas. They report directly into my office, not through the general dispatch system. I read it. If something looks like what Clara was seeing, it gets flagged immediately rather than being buried in an administrative queue. Clara was looking at her. You would need people willing to serve in that network, Clara said. I would need people who already exist, Alara said. People who are already doing the work, like you. I would just be formalizing what they do and making sure the information actually reaches someone who can act on it. Clara was quiet for a moment. You want me in that network, she said. I want you to help me build it, Alara said. You have 11 years and you know the communities. I have an office and a mandate. Between us, we have most of what we need. Clara looked at Kalen. He looked at her with the expression Alara recognized as the one that did not need to say much because the answer was already yes. I will need to return to my district within the fortnight, Clara said. My work there cannot be left indefinitely. I know, Alara said. We have 2 weeks to design it. That is enough to start. Clara looked at her for a moment. You are very young, she said. Yes, Alara said. The people in my network are not going to simply accept direction from someone they do not know because she has an official mandate. I know, Alara said. I am not asking them to accept direction. I am asking them to be heard. There is a difference. Clara held her gaze for another moment. Then she picked up her teacup. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, Alara agreed. The meeting ran for another 2 hours. She and Clara worked through the framework on paper at the side table, while Kalen sat quietly and occasionally answered questions about existing infrastructure and resource availability. It was not unlike the morning she had sat at the council table and thought through the Holt problem out loud with him. The same quality of shared work, the same comfortable silence between thought and speech. Afterward, when Clara had been shown to a guest room, Alara sat in the side chamber alone for a moment. She thought about the fact that she had just spent 2 hours building something that would not have existed without the letter she had written with her real name on it. That letter had brought Clara here. Clara had brought the 11 years and the network and the specific intelligence of someone who had been doing the work on the ground. They had built something in 2 hours that would need 6 months to fully establish, and would probably function for years after that. This was what after looked like. Not empty. Not a destination you arrived at and sat down in. A direction, a thing you were always in the middle of building. She went to find Kalen. He was in his study. She knocked and stepped in. He looked up. Thank you, she said. For what specifically? He said. For telling me she had arrived, she said. You could have met with her yourself first, briefed her, brought me in afterward. No, he said. You could have, she said. It was not the right way to do it, he said. She looked at him. You are consistently, she said, good at knowing the right way. He looked at her steadily. Not always, he said. She stood in his doorway. She thought about the window seat on the 14th day. The 26 days she had spent standing in his council chamber, the records room, the corridor after the gathering, the chair at the corner of the council table. I know what you have been waiting for me to say, she said. He did not move. I am not going to say it in a doorway, she said. Something in his face shifted, not amusement exactly, but adjacent to it. That is fair, he said. I am going to go finish the framework for the classification system, she said, and then I am going to have dinner, and then I am going to think about it for one more evening. Yes, he said. That is the last evening, she said. He looked at her, very carefully. Yes, he said. She turned and went back to her office and did exactly what she had said she was going to do, in exactly that order, with the specific focused attention of someone who had decided something and was now simply moving through the remaining steps before the decision became a spoken thing. She was almost there. She had been building toward this for a long time. Fletcher Crane's tribunal lasted 4 days. Alara attended all 4. She sat in the observer's gallery above the tribunal chamber and watched the proceedings with the same attention she brought to the dispatch logs, looking for pattern, for gap, for the specific quality of a statement that did not quite align with the statement before it. Crane was a careful man. He had spent 4 years building something complicated and careful, and he was careful in the tribunal too, measuring every answer before he gave it. He was not as careful as he thought. On the 3rd day, under questioning about the false dispatch dates, he made a reference to a location that placed him in the capital city during a period when he had officially claimed to be in the eastern provinces. The tribunal counsel noted the inconsistency and pressed it. Crane recognized his mistake within 2 answers and adjusted. But the adjustment was visible. She saw the shift in the set of his shoulders, the slight recalibration of his posture that was what careful people looked like when they had just realized they had made an error. She wrote a note and passed it down to the tribunal counsel through Percy, who had become a reliable conduit for these communications over the past week. The counsel used the note on the fourth day, returned to the location question from a different angle, and caught Crane in a contradiction that collapsed a significant portion of his timeline alibi. She watched from the gallery and did not let herself feel satisfied until she had confirmed, through the door at the end of the fourth session, that the tribunal had found sufficient grounds to proceed to full sentencing. Then she felt it. Not triumphant, not the burning, purposeful feeling of a mission completed. Just finished. A door closing on something that had needed to close for a long time. She walked back to the palace through the afternoon and went to the eastern wing and sat in the window seat. She had been sitting in this particular window seat since her 14th day. She had been in the palace for 2.5 months now, long enough that her presence in the corridor at the window no longer registered with anyone who passed. She was simply a feature of the eastward corridor, the woman who sat in the window with a notebook or a stack of documents or, sometimes, nothing at all. She sat there now with nothing at all, and looked at the courtyard below. A year ago she had been in the mountains. 8 months ago she had cut her hair in the dark. 6 months ago she had finished building a mission against the wrong man. 2.5 months ago she had walked through the palace gate under a false name, carrying nothing she had not earned or made or stolen. She was still here. She thought about the names she had been, Eli, which she had inhabited so completely for so long that she could still slip into its posture without thinking. Elara, which was her own, and which she had been relearning to inhabit naturally, the way you relearn something your body knew before you forgot it. The last survivor of the Ashen Pack, which was a name that circumstances had given her, and which she had carried with the specific weight of something you do not choose. She was working on a new one, not instead of the others, alongside them. She was the person who built the classification system, the person who noticed the handwriting, the person who wrote the letter that brought Clara Dunn to the capital, the person who sat in a cold records room on the night everything changed and made a decision, through absence of action, to stay. She was building who she was going to be next. That was also a name. She got up from the window seat and walked the length of the eastern corridor and down the stairs and through the north junction and knocked on the door of Kalen's study. He opened it. She looked at him. "I said last evening was the last evening," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was," she said. She stepped inside. He stepped back to let her in. The study was the same it always was. The desk, the lamp, the books on the shelves that she had gradually identified as being arranged by subject rather than alphabetically, which was something she had noted and thought about and then tucked away as one of many small things she knew about him that she had not been asked to know. She stood in the middle of the room. She said, "You told me, in the records room, that the bond was not new to you, that you had known since the corridor." "Yes," he said. "You spent 14 days after that trying to understand what I needed before you did anything about it," she said. "Yes. And then you reassigned me to the council chamber," she said, "where you could watch me. Where you could do better work," he said. She looked at him. "Both," she said. He allowed this. "Yes," he said. "Both." She thought about the morning she had stood in this room with the extermination order in her hand and her real name in his voice, and everything she had believed about why she was here in ruins on the floor around her. She thought about how he had let her shout and had not moved toward her and had reached for the document and set it on the desk like evidence for a trial that was not over yet. She thought about the document still being a question. She thought about all the mornings since then. "The bond," she said. "I want you to know that I am not here because of it." He was quiet. "I am here because I chose to be," she said. "Every morning, I know the difference between a thing I am choosing and a thing that is pulling me. The pull is there, I am not going to pretend it is not. But the pull is not why I am standing in your study." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That is why I waited." She held his gaze. "I came here to destroy something," she said. "And I ended up building things instead. Clara's network, the classification system, a function in this palace that did not exist before I arrived. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I stopped being someone running toward a specific end and started being someone who was just here, living a day at a time, doing work that mattered, in a place where I had decided to stay." He was listening with the full attention she had by now entirely stopped being surprised by. "I do not want to be only what I am to you," she said. I want to be what I am to this office. To Clara, to the work. Those are real and they exist separately from you and they need to stay separate. Yes, he said. You understand that, she said. Completely, he said. Then I am saying it, she said. What I did not say last evening. He did not move toward her. He did not need to. He looked at her across the room with the expression that had been there since the second week, the one she had spent a long time trying not to read, and had then spent a long time reading carefully, and had by now simply accepted as a thing that existed and was real. She crossed the room, not to him. She stopped at the corner of his desk, the same distance as the council chamber table corner, the right angle, the familiar geometry they had already established as theirs. I am staying, she said, not as an aid and not as a compromise, and not because I ran out of other options. I am staying because I want to be here, and because the work is real, and because I made something in this palace that I am not finished with. She paused. And because, she said, I have been counting the seconds since the first time our shoulders touched in the study window and I am tired of counting. He looked at her. A long moment. Then he said, very quietly, 11 seconds. She stared at him. You counted, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him for another moment. She said, you are insufferable. He almost smiled. Not the almost she had catalogued before, not the subtle shift, but the real edge of something genuine and warm. She had not seen that before. She was glad she was seeing it now. She did not move any closer, and he did not move any closer, because they were both people who had spent a long time being careful, and neither of them was going to change that in a single conversation. But the distance between them was a chosen distance now, not a defended one, and that was entirely different. The acknowledgement, she said. The restoration record, my pack. Yes, he said. I want to go back, she said, to the mountains, when the Crane Tribunal is complete. I want to go back and do something official, a marker, something that says they were there. Yes, he said, we will go. We. She had said it to him and he had said it back, and neither of them had commented on the word, because it did not need commenting on. It was simply true. She looked at the desk. She looked at the lamp. She looked at the shelves arranged by subject. I need to finish the classification framework, she said. Yes, he said. She turned for the door. She stopped. She turned back. She said, you told me, in the records room on the night I found the order, that you had read every name in the field report, all 14. Yes, he said. Did you read them only once, she said, or more than once? He was quiet for a moment. Several times, he said. She held that. She said, my mother's name was Nina. He said, yes. Nina Voss, she was listed as pack elder. She was not the oldest, Alara said. She was just the most organized. They gave it to her because she was the one everyone actually came to when they needed to think something through. He listened. My father's name was Corin, she said. He kept the trading records. He was terrible at it. He made mistakes with the columns every single season, and my mother fixed them, and he acted surprised every time, as though he had not been making the same mistake for 15 years. She stopped. She was smiling. It was the first time she had talked about her parents and smiled. She held that fact carefully for a moment, the way you hold something fragile while you check whether it is going to survive being held. It survived. I will tell you the rest of them, she said, another time. Yes, he said, I would like that. She went back to her office and finished the classification framework by midnight. She went to bed and slept without mapping exits and woke up to the sound of the courtyard below beginning its morning, and lay in the light for a moment before getting up. She had things to do. She was glad about that. The mountains looked exactly the same. She had been afraid, during the journey north, that they would have changed in the way that places change when you carry them too long in your head, that the real version would be smaller or quieter, or less than what she had kept preserved in the version she visited in her sleep. The mountains were not smaller or quieter. They were exactly as they had been. The cold was the same cold. The particular quality of light at altitude, clear and thin and honest, was the same light. They arrived at the edge of the territory on a Thursday morning, Ilara and Kalen and 4 members of his household staff who had come to help with the formal work, and Clara Dunn, who had made the journey from her own district specifically for this day. Ilara walked ahead of the group on the last stretch. She needed to do that part alone. The village was still there, in the way that foundations remain after the rest is gone. The stone outlines of the buildings, the well in the center of what had been the main yard, The fence posts along the eastern edge that her father had installed the summer before. Nature had begun the slow work of reclaiming the clearings. There was green growing through the stone outlines that had not been there when she left. She stood at the edge of the village and looked at all of it. She had not been back since the morning she walked away. The graves were at the north edge of the village, which was where they had always put them. The community graves going back generations, the oldest markers barely legible, the newest ones raw and without ceremony when she had last seen them. She walked there now. She had asked the palace's stoneworkers, in the weeks before the journey, to cut 14 markers, not elaborate. She had not wanted elaborate. She had wanted clean stone with clean letters. Each name, each birth year, nothing else that she had not chosen. The markers had been brought up on a separate cart. She stood at the graves for a long time before she went back for the others. The installation took most of the morning. She did not observe from a distance. She worked alongside the palace staff, carrying the stones, ensuring each one was seated correctly in the ground. Clara worked beside her without speaking, which was the right thing to do, and which Alara appreciated in the specific way she appreciated people who understood when silence was more useful than words. Kalen worked with them. She had not asked him to. He had simply put on practical clothing that morning and helped carry stones, and she had looked at him doing this and had not needed to say anything about it because there was nothing to say that the action had not already said. When the 14 markers were in place, they stood back. It was a quiet space. The mountains were quiet above it, the kind of quiet that was not empty but full of wind and pine, and the specific vast indifference of high places that had been here before the village and would be here long after. It was not a comforting kind of quiet. It did not make the loss smaller, but it was honest, and she had always responded better to honest things than comforting ones. She stood in front of her parents' markers, Nina Voss, Corin Voss. She thought about the trading records with the wrong columns. She thought about her mother's voice in the next room. She thought about the morning she had walked away from this place and decided to become something purposeful, something that moved forward rather than staying still inside the grief. She thought about the 6 months that had followed and the 49 days since the palace gate, and the fact that she was standing here now as someone who had made real things in the world while carrying the weight of this loss, rather than, instead of carrying it. She did not try to say anything to the stones. She was not someone who talked to stones. But she stood there for long enough that it became a kind of conversation anyway. The formal reading happened at midday. A document from the palace archives, read aloud in the open air of the mountain village, naming the Ashen Pack, and what had been done, and what the record now held in correction. Alara stood and listened to it in the cold mountain light. She had heard these words before, in the palace's main hall, in front of the court. They sounded different here, smaller and more real. Less like an official act and more like something that had been owed for a long time and was finally being paid. Clara added her own words after. She had not prepared anything formal. She spoke about the community network and the months of trying and the silence from the capital, and then she spoke about what had changed and what was being built, and what she hoped the regional oversight network would make possible for communities like this one in the future. She spoke well. She was good at this in the way of people who had spent a long time finding the language for difficult things. Alara said only a few words. She said, the Ashen Pack existed. They were people who kept trading records and organized their community and argued about the best way to do things and were wrong sometimes and right sometimes and had lives that mattered, because all lives matter, and not because they did anything particular to earn the mattering. She said that their names were now on record and their history was no longer marked as an unresolved inquiry, and she was going to carry them forward the way she had been carrying them. Not as a weight, but as the foundation of what she was standing on. She said, this is what happened. This is what happens now. She stopped. The mountains were quiet around her. Kalen was standing slightly to her left. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. She thought about the first time she had seen his face, crossing the main hall of the palace, moving through people who made space for him without being asked, watchful and quiet, and not at all what she had imagined. She thought about 14 days of window seat lunches, and 26 days of standing at her station. She thought about a document held in a specific way over a council table so that 2 sets of fingers would not brush. She thought about a name said carefully, like something kept. She thought about 11 seconds. She walked the 2 steps to stand beside him. Not close enough to touch. The chosen distance, the geography they had established together without explicitly establishing it. He turned his head and looked at her. She said quietly, so that only he could hear it, I am glad I came here. He understood she meant both places. The mountains and the palace. Yes, he said. She looked at the 14 stone markers in the cold mountain light. She was standing on the foundation of her dead, which was not the same as standing in the shadow of them. She could feel the difference. She had been learning the difference since the night in the records room, when she held the extermination order in her hands, and the floor shifted, and she had to rebuild every assumption from the ground up. You could carry people forward without being pulled back by them. You could grieve and still move. You could be the last one standing from a thing that was destroyed, and decide that being the last one standing was not only a fact about loss but also a fact about survival. And survival was something. Survival was in fact quite a lot. She was Alara Voss. She was the intelligence officer of the palace's Eastern Communications Wing. She was the person who had noticed the handwriting. She was the co-architect of the regional oversight network that Clara Dunn was going to spend the next year building into something real and lasting. She was the person who had walked through a gate under a false name and come out the other side with her real one. She was not finished yet. She was, in fact, barely started. She breathed in the cold mountain air, the dawn-quality air she had dreamed of, thin and honest and full of pine, and let it fill her lungs completely. Then she turned to Kalen. "I am ready to go back," she said. He looked at her. "When you are," he said. "Now," she said. They walked back toward the road together, and Clara joined them, and the household staff followed, and the horses were waiting at the tree line, and the road down from the mountains was long and cold and perfectly manageable. She did not look back. She did not need to. She carried them with her, all 14, the way she had always carried them, not as a weight to be set down at some future finish line, but as part of the structure of who she was, built in, permanent, and hers. She rode down out of the mountains. She had a framework to finish, and a network to build, and a cross-reference to complete, and a letter from Clara's Eastern District contact waiting in the intake tray that was probably relevant, and definitely needed her attention before the end of the week. She had work to do. She had a life to get on with. She was ready for both.